Well, as we continue our journey into the I am statements of Jesus, he says that when you tap into him, you get the kind of fruit in your life that God's trying to produce. And yet I am always amazed at my inability to produce the kind of fruit I want in my life. And it's not a lack of education. Did you know you're not supposed to do this? Yeah, I knew. I'm always shocked at the bad fruit that comes out of my life. Just a couple weeks ago, my son, I have an autistic son who's 8, developmentally about 3, and he was just having a bad day and punched himself in the head, which is very uncommon these days. He's doing really well. And it's just very, very frustrating. When he has a bad day, we're having a bad day. We're trying to figure out what's going on, and just a very exhausting day. Patience has run out. Compassion has run out. Frustration's high. And now he's just screaming, which he never does, just screaming on his way to bed. And I'm like, all right, I'll lay down with him. And so I decide I'm going to lay down with him. And as I'm laying down in bed with him, he always has one hand he puts right on your hand. Make sure you don't move. You're going to be there all night long. So after about 10 minutes, it seems like he's starting to doze off. So I'm doing the get my hand free. Another 15 minutes go by. I've been laying there now for 45 minutes. And now I'm doing the dance. Get out of bed dance. And now I just have to make it to the door. I need to put a screw in the floor there. I'm thinking, I've made it. As I just get to the door, open the door, he starts screaming again, and I lose it. I just lose it. Maybe because of the long day, maybe because of frustration, maybe because I want to make love to my wife and he's getting away with it. I don't know what the cause was, but I just know I'm like, just shut up. We're done. We're done. And I'm like, what is wrong with me? I know not to say shut up to my son. I know not to yell at a child, let alone an autistic one. Where is this impatience, this anger, this frustration coming from? Why can't I produce the kind of fruit I want in my life? One of the fun things we like to do as a family is we love to get together and do science experiments. And so I'll occasionally bring some dry ice home, and we love playing with dry ice. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I decided to head over town. There's a Target that actually sells dry ice. And so I went and I got this big cooler, and I got my dry ice. And as I've got the dry ice, I'm in line, and I'm standing in line, the shopping area. And as I show up, there's just one person in front of me, and I love fast lines. So I stand here, and I notice it's a pretty good-looking 30-year-old woman. And so I sort of take a mental snapshot of her from the back for a second. And I hear sort of this voice going, hey, purity, integrity, take thoughts captive. Hey, that's a good voice. I need to be tapped into more of that. And so I look away, and so how do I redivert my eyes? I look at the dry ice. It's kind of like a cold shower, really, if you hold on to the dry ice. And so I'm redirecting myself. And then, okay, thank you. Whatever that self-control came from wasn't from me. I appreciate that wisdom. And so I thought, well, I'm going to see what she's buying. So I look for my dry ice, and sure enough, she's buying a piece of lingerie and negligee sitting right there next to my dry ice. And now, in that moment, I've got the image of seeing her a second ago that I was trying to take captive, and I've got the image of the lingerie she's buying, and I'm just about to put these together. And I feel again the voice of wisdom coming from some source beyond me saying integrity, innocence, faithfulness. And I was so glad because the next moment she turns around and says, well, hi, Pastor. What a horrible human being I am. What a horrible pastor I am. And at that moment, I was like, man, thank you that I had access to some other resource for wisdom, for strength, and for direction. And that's what it means. It doesn't mean you don't struggle, but it means that when you're going through difficulty or struggles, you've got a resource you can tap into to produce the fruit. It doesn't come from you, it comes from God. And what Jesus is going to tell us today is that there's 2 vines in your life. One vine, you tap into this thing. It's not the true vine, but there's several vines you can tap into. Self-centeredness. There's a kind of vine that you build your whole identity on how other people think of you, people's approval, whether or not you did the right thing, whether or not you performed well. And that vine leads to sour grapes. Regret, shame, lack of faithfulness, lust, revenge. There is a vine you can tap into that will lead to sour grapes. But there's another vine, and this vine, when you tap into this vine, it leads not to sour grapes, but it leads rather to fine wine. And specifically, the kind of fine wine mentioned by Paul that comes from this vine is love, joy, peace, self-control, goodness, hope. And this fine wine is the stuff against which things there's no law. There's no regret. There's no pain. There's no lack of innocence. And so the question Jesus is going to propose to us is, what vine are you tapped into these days? Not what do you call yourself, because you may call yourself a God follower or a Christ follower. The question is, who do you tap into? What vine do you tap into for finding security, finding peace, rewarding yourself, finding your identity? Notice how Jesus says it. It's pretty fascinating, really. Jesus says, I am the true vine in John 15. I'm the true vine. As if there's other not true vines you could be tempted or be tapped into. He's saying there's lots of imposters out there. There's lots of other challengers out there, but I am the true vine. And this is going to mean so much to the Jewish audience looking for a vine dresser, but it also means an awful lot to the Greco-Roman world, because if you asked anyone in Jesus' day who is not a Jew and is not a following of a particular Jewish religion, and you said, who is the vine? They would tell you exactly who the vine is. And they would say the vine was a man god named Dionysus. If you ever studied Greek-Roman literature or art or the gods or seen some of the movies, Dionysus is referenced. And every time you see his sculpture, he's always got grapes in his hair. And the reason he has grapes in his hair is because he was known as the one who made wine. He's the one who invented what they called the nectar of the gods. And Dionysus had several things that were fascinating about his myth. Number one is that Dionysus was not only the god who made wine and the vine of life, he was also known as the inventor or creator of theater. And so what would happen with Dionysus is this. The first time a play, you think of all the movies and TV shows and drama we have today, the first play ever recorded was enacting the myth of Dionysus, the vine. And there's gigantic Greek theaters all over the world to show the different ways in which Dionysus would show himself. In fact, every time you see a sculpture of him, you'll notice he's almost always holding a cup of wine, because he was the god who was the wine. I was in Turkey about 2 years ago, and I got a chance to visit one of the worship centers for Dionysus. Now, this is actually in Turkey, a place called Pergamum. If you read the book of Revelation, you'll probably recognize that this is one of the letters written to this location. It's called the place where Satan lives. There's a gigantic mountain really. At the top of the mountain is a temple to Zeus, a temple to Apollo, a temple to Dionysus, and there were Christians here trying to make Jesus the true vine in the midst of a whole host of false vines. What would happen is you see the theater here, the giant theater, they would act out the myth of Dionysus, the vine. And then at the end of that theater, a procession would come down, a procession with all kinds of just crazy, chaotic music, and they would end here at the temple, and this was the temple of Dionysus. And they would bring with them a gigantic jar full of water, 30, 40 gallon kind of thing, and they would place these containers of water before the temple. Now, some scholars believe that this myth or this practice didn't occur until after Jesus. Some believe it occurred before Jesus. Either way, you're going to see the connection to John chapter 2 in a moment. They would bring the gallons of water here to the temple, and the priest would take the big containers of water into the temple. The next day, everyone would return, and the water had turned into wine. Some people think that happened through myth. Some people think that happened through magic. Some people think that happened because everybody went away and they swapped it out with wine. Either way, they showed up the next day, and they would drink of the vine, and they would get totally plastered, totally drunk. And to lose control to the wine of Dionysus was to find meaning, to be your real self, to be comfortable with yourself. And after you drank all the wine you could, you would then move from the temple all the way down to this party area. In this party area would be a loss of innocence, debauchery, a lack of faithfulness. In fact, there's these trenches that go around this section called a vomitorium. Because when you got to this area, you would commune with the gods, by eating bread from Demeter, the bread of life, and then you would drink of the wine from Dionysus, the vine of life, and you would devour a cow that you had sacrificed without cooking it. Thus why you were vomiting. And what I think is going on here with Dionysus, it shows that as you follow certain practices that are not Jesus, you're going to end up with a lack of innocence, chaos in your community, chaos in your family. You're going to have regrets. You're going to say, why did I do that? There are certain vines that when you tap into them, they promise immediate relief from your problems, immediate success for whatever you're struggling with, but you end up here in the vomitorium, not experiencing the life that you want because you didn't tap into the real vine that leads to fine wine. You tapped into a false vine who leads to sour grapes. So with that in mind, Jesus is going to show up and he's going to show that he's the true vine and he is supreme to Dionysus in several ways. Number one, his fruit is better. It's love, joy, peace, hope. You can never have too much of that. You never have to end up in the vomitorium when you have too much courage, too much life, too much peace in your life. Number two, Dionysus was known as the dying and rising god. Because he was an agricultural god, every December he would die when winter came. And so he was known as a god who died every year. And then come springtime, when you saw the vines begin to rebirth, he was also known as the resurrection god, because he would be raised as he raised up your crops. And so as you worshiped him as the god of wine, the god of theater, also the god who is the death and resurrection god. Now, it's into that everyone had heard this, but this wasn't real. This was just a myth. No one had really seen Dionysus ever. No one had ever seen him die or be raised from the dead. But this was the myth. That it was the smoke and mirrors of the story. And Jesus, in the way John writes the book of John, comes into the culture who's obsessed with Dionysus and says, you've tried that. I want to show you another way, a better way. Jesus got better fruit, and he's got a better death and resurrection. Because what Dionysus did in myth, Jesus will do in history. Jesus comes into history, which is why Christianity is not primarily a religion or philosophy. It primarily claims and backs up the claims to be history. God came into history and did in history what Dionysus claimed to do in myth. He died on an old Roman cross. And 3 days later, which he had predicted in advance, he raises himself from the dead. And not in myth, not in fairy story, not in it's a good allegory for life. No. With actual eyewitnesses. Skeptical eyewitnesses, believing eyewitnesses, Jewish eyewitnesses. The book of Corinthians tells us that when Jesus raises himself from the dead, he has a real body, not his spirit, not a story. He can eat fish, he can hug people, he can eat honeycomb. And what Jesus says and what Paul tells us is that over 500 people saw him in a resurrected body. And what Jesus is saying is, I am the true vine. I am the real resurrection. Where Dionysus would say, I am the resurrection and the life. I'm telling you, I am the resurrection and the life. When he says he is the vine, I'm telling you, I am the vine. And he says he makes wine. Let me tell you what I can do. And this is why John, I think, starts off his gospel with the first miracle in John chapter 2. See if it sounds familiar. Jesus' mother said to the servants, whatever Jesus says to you, do it. Now that's just good advice, by the way, for life. Even if you don't understand it, don't believe it, God says, obey me, do it. And you're going to find stuff, you have resources to wisdom and courage and grace and compassion if you'll practice my way. Now, there were set there, oh, that's interesting, 6 water pots of stone. The Greek-Roman audience would immediately go, like Dionysus worship service. The Jewish audience would say, oh yeah, we're used to that, according to the manner of purification of the Jews. The Jews would often bring things of water because they would wash in them before temple. They would have a mikvah, they would bathe in that before going into God's presence. So it's simultaneously speaking to both audiences. It contained 20 or 30 gallons apiece, and Jesus said to them, fill the water pots with water, and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, draw some of the water out in a cup, and take it to the master of the feast. And they took it to him. And they're a little embarrassed. It's supposed to be wine, they're bringing water. The master grabs the cup. He's about to drink it, and here's what the scriptures say. As the master goes to taste it, next slide, it says, he tasted the water that was made wine. It turned into wine. Jesus did in actuality what Dionysus could only do in myth. And he calls the bridegroom, the master does, and says, hey, you know what? I've been to a lot of parties. Every time I have a party, every man at the beginning sets out the best wine. Then when people have drank too much and their taste buds aren't working quite as well, then they bring out the inferior wine. But you have kept the good wine, the best wine, until now. And Jesus is saying, if you follow me as a true vine, you don't get a quick high that runs out to something inferior. The kind of fruit I have for you is sustainable through life, creating the best relationships, the best decisions, not shame and guilt and a lack of innocence and a destruction of faithfulness. That's what Jesus is promising here. And while the Greco-Roman world would notice this is an affront to Dionysus, it also would speak to the Jewish audience who knew Isaiah. God always used the metaphor of a vineyard to describe his people. Now, you may have the idea that God of the Old Testament is mean and nasty. Listen to the heart of a loving father. This is the God of the Old Testament speaking about his care and concern for you. Let me sing. You ever thought of the Old Testament God as a singer? Let me sing to my well-beloved. That's what he calls us. A song of my beloved. He's writing love songs for you. Regarding his vineyard. You're like a vineyard to me. My well-beloved has a vineyard on a very fruitful hill. I want my people to be vineyards who produce fruitful hills in their life. And so God himself said, I'm willing to dig up the dirt, toil the ground to produce the kind of environment where you can produce the fruit you need. More than that, I'm willing to get my hands dirty. I'm going to clear out the rocks, generational patterns. If you'll invite me into your vineyard, we'll pull out some stuff that your grandparents struggled with and your parents struggled with. We'll finally get that rock out of there. God says, I'm going to dig into that, clear out the stones, and I'm going to plant in your vineyard the choicest vine, the best vine, the vine that can produce the best kind of fruit in your life. And I'm going to also put a tower in there so people can gather together and make a wine press in it so we can take the fruit and create a kind of nectar that people can enjoy, not to be controlled by it, but to enjoy it for celebrations together. And God expected it to bring forth good grapes. He expects fruitfulness. But instead it brought forth wild grapes. It tapped into a different vine despite everything he did, which God says in the next verse, what more could I have done? Could you judge between me and my vineyard? I dug it. I plowed it. I watered it. What more could have been done to my vineyard that I've not done for it? And then he explains the metaphor. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the people, the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant plant, the choice vine. And for years people said, God's going to one day come in the future and bring the choicest vine and do for us himself what couldn't have been done through the nation of Judah. So before we dig into that for a second, let's go back here. Regardless of whether you call yourself a Christian or God follower, which vine are you really tapped into when you see what comes out of you when you get confronted, when you get criticized, when you're in a marital dispute, when you don't like what your parents have to say? What comes out of you, sour grapes or fine wine? Because you can trace your wine to figure out your vine. Let's take a moment and do that. Let's trace our wine, what's coming out of our life, and figure out what our vine is. If you're finding defensiveness coming out of your life, you need to defend yourself. It's because you don't recognize you have an identity rooted in being the most high child of God. So you have to defend yourself all the time. You're not tapped into the vine. You feel like you need to be cruel, or you wrestle with shame. You're not tapped into the vine. I'm not saying you're not a Christian, not going to heaven. I'm saying you're not accessing the resources of the vine. Are you anxious? Are you self-righteous? You really believe your way is best and you look down on other people? Are you short-tempered? Avoiding things rather than really believing the truth can set you free? Are you unthankful? Romans 1 says one of the worst sins is being unthankful. Oh my goodness, that made the list? Lustful. After people, after things. I lust for more approval. I lust for more things. I lust for a bigger bank account. I lust for more savings. Now, we all struggle with that. And in those moments you're struggling with those things, you're not tied into the true vine. When you're tied in the true vine, you start finding stuff coming out of your life that are beyond your resources. You're teachable. You don't get defensive because you say, I'm probably wrong here. God had to die for how wrong I am, so I'm going to assume I'm partially to blame in this argument. I'm teachable. I'm God-controlled. There's a kind of self-control that's coming outside of my resources. There's a patience that's beyond me, a kindness, a humility. I'm beginning to love with a kind of love that's supernatural. Faithfulness, peacefulness. There's a goodness and a joyfulness that transcends understanding. One of the ironies is that people that call themselves Christians or call themselves religious are some of the most self-righteous people you ever meet. And they say they're tied into Jesus, but what's coming out of them shows that they're not abiding in him. And I would propose to you that all of us, in a given week, if we tracked ourselves, have a lot of self-righteousness coming out of ourselves that shows we're not abiding in the vine. I'll give you an example. My son was 9 months old, and I took him to a tennis match. So my daughter was playing tennis. She was in junior high at the time, so she's finishing up her last game, and she noticed that I was there with Mr. Quinn. And she's so excited. Oh, it's Mr. Quinn. She calls all her friends. He's here. Come here. So all her girlfriends come around. They're all about 7th grade. And they're like, oh, he's so cute. Yeah, here he is, Mr. Quinn. And I said, can we hold him? I'm like, well, sure you can hold him. So I take my 9-month and I hand him to my daughter, and she's holding him. And her friends are like, could we hold him? And I'm like, oh, sure, you can hold him. And so our 9-month's being passed around, and they're just loving on him. And then I turned, and I saw the look of several mothers who were shocked at such horrible parenting that someone would take a 9-month child and put it in the hands of strangers, 7th grade girls. What kind of a lousy father would that be? Now, they said all this without saying a word. It was like this look of like, and you know what? I would have felt condemned, and I would have felt guilty, and I would have felt bad, except that I countered them with my own degree of self-righteousness. Thank you, God, that I'm not like those hovering, overprotective moms whose kids are going to rebel against them because they've never been able to do anything their entire life. Right? We're both self-righteous. I'm self-righteous about my lenient parenting. I wouldn't even call it lenient, I'd call it experiential. And they are self-righteous about their protective parenting. And here's my point. Whether it's with your husband, with your friends, you're going to disagree on parenting. You're going to disagree on a lot of things. And that's okay. But when you feel or sense self-righteousness, you are not attached to the vine. Because I know parents who are very lenient, who God has used. I know parents who are very protective, God has used. And you can tell the difference between somebody who agrees with something strongly, but there isn't that self-righteousness in there. There's a humility in there. There's a teachable spirit in there. And ironically, we can take things, good things, that we're trying to obey God in, and we can turn them into self-righteous practices. Take alcohol, for example. Some people would say Christians should never drink. Some would say Christians should drink, but just not have it control them. And I know Christians who take both positions. And yet you can get self-righteous about the fact you don't drink, and you can get self-righteous about the fact that you do drink. Thank goodness I'm not one of those legalists. Thank goodness I'm not one of those drunkards. Right? Both self-righteous. Which the Bible says don't be controlled by alcohol. Well, I'll tell you a story. We went on a Carnival cruise line when my daughter was still in the womb. And while we were on that trip, I remember we went on a catamaran and we were going to go snorkeling. And I was so looking forward to it. And we went not just with our family, but our extended family. My mom, my dad, brothers, their wives, sister, husband. And then our extended family, my dad's brother and his family. And so we're on this catamaran, just having a great time. We're heading out. It's a beautiful sunny day in the Bahamas. We're about to go out snorkeling. And as we're just sort of enjoying the day, I'm sitting next to one of my relatives, my dad's brother, and I'm like, hey, are you He's just sitting there stewing. Like, how can you be unhappy in the Bahamas, for crying out loud? I said, what's going on? He's like, I just can't relate to any of this. We're going snorkeling. What are you talking about, any of this? He's like, look at all these people drinking alcohol. Yeah, I didn't even notice because I'm not a big drinker myself, but they're walking around with the pictures of beer, and I'm like, oh yeah. It's like, did you know that 1 drop of alcohol has never touched these lips? At that moment, God had the catamaran hit either a whale or a wave. I'm not sure which. Whatever it was wonderful. The catamaran hit the thing, boom, popped up. One of the waiters, who had a whole pitcher of alcohol, was walking toward us at the time. It would have hit me, but thank goodness I did a matrix. So that my uncle could turn and make... But it looks something like this. We're going along, boom. No, push. And you could look real closely. There was one drop. And here's my uncle. No, hit him right in the lip. It hit him. It was so awesome. He couldn't say that ever again. And then the rest of it poured all over him. He smelled like a wino the rest of the day. It was so incredible. And in that moment, he's so self-righteous about the good thing he's doing, and I'm equally self-righteous about why I'm not like him. Oh, that's what's wrong in the human heart. When you're not connected to the vine, you don't lean into God's righteousness, you lean into your own righteousness, which is why the second point is so critical. We need a vine, but secondly, we need to look at and trace the fruits to our roots. What's coming out of your life these days? Are you seeing a lot of death, complaining, critical spirit, lack of love, lack of compassion? And you say to yourself, yeah, I got to work on that. That hasn't worked before. Why would it work now? If you've got an apple tree and you want to produce pears, does the apple tree need to go, oh, no. An apple tree is never going to produce pears. Why? The problem is not the fruit. The problem is what? The root. And so if you're seeing death come out of your life, it's because under the surface, you have tied in to something dead. There is something dead that you're using to find your identity, to find your comfort, to find your sense of a source of meaning and purpose. And the roots are tied into that death. And it's usually something good. My approval, my performance, things we mentioned last week. And so the issue is you don't need to work harder to be a better person. That's not going to work. You need to go, oh my goodness, I need to repent, confess, agree with God that I have tapped into something besides Him to produce meaning in my life. Meanwhile, when you look at your life and you begin to see life, good stuff come out of your life, you don't take credit for it and get self-righteous. Have you seen my humility trophy? It's awesome. Because you know it's the fruit of His Spirit. Because what's happened is you have tapped into a root system that is filled with life and light. And the root system is that you now have access to resources, nourishment, coming from a greater source. So as a Christian, if you want to grow as a Christian, you don't say, this week I'm working on self-control. Week later, that didn't work out. This week I'm working on love. That didn't work out. This week I'm looking on hope. Working harder is not how you produce fruit. You get closer to the source of nourishment. Which is why there's theologians call this the communicable attributes of God. Think about a communicable disease. You get around somebody who has a communicable disease, you catch what they have. Well, the Bible and theologians describe God as somebody who has communicable attributes. Now, some you can't catch. You don't catch omnipresence. You don't catch omniscience. But you do catch His communicable attributes. You spend time with God. You begin to feel, experience how much He's forgiven you. You get close to the root of how much you've been forgiven. You find yourself wanting to forgive others. You realize how short-tempered, how patient, how compassionate, how long-suffering God has been to you, you get close to that, you feel that, you experience that, and you catch his communicable attributes. You begin to have more compassion, patience, long-suffering, because you've caught what God has by getting close to him. Which is why Jesus in John 15 says, the secret to putting fruit in your life and bearing great fruit is abiding in him. Every branch that wants to produce more fruit needs to abide in me. Look how many times he says abide in me. Look at the next part of the verse. A branch cannot bear fruit of itself. See, you can't pop out those pears unless it abides in the vine. You need a root system. Neither can you unless you abide in me. There it is again. I am the vine. I am the resource. I am the wisdom. I am the strength you're looking for. You're the branches. He who abides in me, there it is again, and me in him bears much fruit. If you're not going to abide in me and try and do it on your own, without me, you can do nothing. Now, I say I believe the Bible. And intellectually, I do. I have not lived an hour of my life practicing this verse as if I believe it functionally. I walk out of here, I don't walk around in my job, in my marriage, and go, God, I can't bear fruit if you're not in this. I can do nothing without you. No, I walk out of here self-sufficient, my ideas, my talents, my experience. And God says, you're not abiding in me. What I want most from you is dependence. I think if I counted up the number of minutes in a given week, that I'm really living out the reality that apart from him I can do nothing. Maybe I got a half hour in a good week. And God's saying, abide in me. Root yourself in me. So the takeaway for us is not to work harder, but to get closer. How do we get closer to God? Think of the vine with a series of plug-ins. How do you plug into the vine? One way we plug into the vine, God has given us the Bible. And as we read the Bible, God's designed that to be a way that we find truth about God flowing into us, but more than just reading words, that he can speak to us through the Bible. It's a way we plug in and we have access to the sap. And the sap is his Holy Spirit who's speaking to us. We're learning things that are true about God that we're like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that. Things that are true about the world, what really is broken. Things true about ourselves, well, I really am lying to myself here. So the Bible is a way that you connect with the vine where you allow God to speak to you and through you. It's like a book that reads you and communicates to you. There was a philosopher by the name of Émile Caliet, just prior to World War I. He was in his 20s. And one of his vines was his education. Education will solve my problems. Specifically, he was a philosophy major. He said, philosophy and education give me everything I need. Until he got drafted into World War I. But even then, he was pretty cocky. He was down in a trench hole one day with his best friend serving next to him. And he was just pontificating about all the ways in which philosophy and his education gave him meaning and purpose and what he was going to do after their time in the war. There'd been a ceasefire for a while, and his back and knees were killing him. So they looked up, the coast was clear, and he and his buddy were just talking for a while. And he was pontificating again, the way philosophy and education was the real secret to life. He turned back and he saw a bullet go right past him, hit his friend, kill him right before him, blood all over his uniform. And he was devastated. He writes in his journal that no amount of philosophy could help him deal with the mourning of the death of his best friend that he had witnessed. In that moment, his education seemed so stale, so worthless. His philosophy seemed to have no answers to what he faced as an agnostic. He got out of the war soon after that, and he said, you know what I need? I need a book that can read me. A book that understands me. A book that knows when I need comfort, when I need hope, when I need help. So he decided to write his own. He began to write a book, and he would put in it his favorite excerpts that he'd pick up along the way. So one month he'd be reading a poem, and it really inspired him. He'd write the words of that poem in his book. Another time he might be reading Moby Dick and talk about overcoming revenge, and he'd write that passage in. He spent 2 years compiling a book that understood him. He says in his journal that when he compiled the book, he sat under an apple tree, and he sat down to finally have something that gave him meaning and purpose and hope. He opened the first page, and he read that poem he'd written 2 years ago that had spoken to him. And it just felt stale. He remembered it being meaningful 2 years ago, but it wasn't meaningful now. And each page, this was not the book that could read him. It lacked freshness. It lacked everything. He was so frustrated, he threw the book down. He headed into his house. He was 23 at that time. He said he never had a Bible in his house, and his wife had happened to bring home a Bible, never even seen one before. He picked up the Bible, and he flipped open to Matthew chapter 5 and the Beatitudes. And for the first time in his life, he read, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." And it hit him that he had never really mourned. And what he desperately needed was comfort. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. That's what I'm hungering for, truth. He just devoured this book. And it wasn't he was reading something. He said it was like someone was speaking to me through it. And over the next couple of months, he devoured the Bible. And what was amazing to him is he'd go back to a passage he read a few days earlier, and it was like a different portion of it stood out differently than before. It's like the Bible moved and shaped and changed and spoke to him in different ways at different times. He said, finally, I found a book that reads me. And as you grow as a Christian, you'll get to the place that you don't go to the Bible so you can check off a list, because I need to hear from you, God. And it doesn't just become something, and it's kind of weird to say it this way, but it's like there's someone in the Bible speaking to you, comforting you, convicting you, challenging you. And one of the major ways that we tie into the vine is we have a regular dose of connecting to God through the Bible. The second thing, which is mentioned here, sometimes there's three types of branches mentioned in John. The one that produces fruit, he prunes to produce more fruit. There's a second branch he mentions in verse 2, and that is the branch that everyone else seems to be producing great fruit. This is a vine that is attached to the branch, but it is not producing any fruit. It's got maybe a leaf or two, but there is no fruit. In fact, it's starting to die and decay. And look what he says in John chapter 2, or 15 verse 2. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, so it's in me. So this is a Christian. This is a branch that's in me, but when it doesn't bear fruit, he cuts it off. Oh my goodness. We're back to work. So I got to work. And if I don't work hard enough, God's going to cut me off. This sounds horrible. What in the world does that mean? What's interesting, the word used here is the word arrow in Greek for cuts off. And so in hermeneutics, to study the Bible, what you want to do is you want to say, why did they choose? There's 4 definitions for arrow. One is cuts off, one's lifted up, and one is picked up. Why did the writer or translator of the Bible choose this particular translation? So did the same writer, John, use that same word anywhere else to give us added meaning? And look what happens. This word, they picked up, arrow, what was left over. 12 full baskets in Matthew. Let's look at John. Therefore, they picked up stones. They didn't break them off or cut them off. They picked up stones, arrowed them. John chapter 5, verse 8. Jesus said to him, get up, pick up, arrow your pallet, and walk. Then Jesus raised up, lifted up, arrowed up his eyes, and said, Father, I thank you. There was also a common practice in the day that if a wine dresser who'd already put all the work into producing fruit found a plant that was abiding, it was attached to the vine, but it wasn't producing fruit, it was just mildewy and it was not growing well, what he would do is he would actually prop it up, like you might with a tomato plant. And by doing that, this branch that had been laying on the ground, not producing fruit, all of a sudden could be lifted up by the vine dresser. And now, having been lifted up, that branch that was not bearing fruit was lifted up, that was picked up in such a way that it could start to produce fruit again. And for some of us, we're worn out from trying. I say, God, I'm not producing fruit. I know it. I feel guilty about it. And one of the greatest things we can do to connect to the vine is let God lift us up. pick us up. My wife and I were in Turkey several years ago. We're walking through a Turkish vineyard. And while we're there, we're just overwhelmed with autism. We're overwhelmed with the depression of trying to figure out how to deal with autism, the effect on our life, the effect on our marriage. And as we were here in this vineyard, we did a Bible study on John chapter 15, verse 2. And Ray Vander Laan, who's a sort of famous Jewish Christian scholar, shared with us these insights about when you're not bearing fruit, it may be because the vine dresser needs to lift you up, pick you up, and put you in a place that you can. And we had such a powerful moment, the two of us here, going, God, that's what we need. Pick us up that we may bear fruit. Lift us up that we may bear fruit. And when you begin to really believe that apart from him you can do nothing, that the vine is the real resource that we all need, you do the third thing that helps us get closer. You embrace the vine. Every moment you say, God, I need your resources to be the kind of husband I need to be the kind of sister I need to be. God, I need your resources to forgive. This doesn't feel very forgivable to me. God, I just need to embrace you. I need your wisdom. This is beyond my capacity. God, I am embracing the vine here. Every once in a while, I've stumbled in a day where I've got this right. I took my son Quinn skiing. I take him about 2 times a week because he loves skiing. It's something we do together. And so he skis between my legs. And so part of that's a real challenge because my back's bent over, and as he gets taller, my back's not quite as bad as it used to be. But I just had some back issues, and as I'm skiing with Quinn that day, I'm in a good place, but I'm afraid that we're going to fall. I'm afraid I'm going to hurt it. And I tell you, every 2 minutes as I'm skiing with him, I'm praying, God, apart from you, I can do nothing. Protect my back. Help me be here for my son. Be my strength. Be my resource. All day long I skied, and all day long I prayed. I don't think I've ever prayed such dependent prayers. God's like, this is how I want you to live all the time. Abiding in me. I remember when my son was about a year, we were about to move into our new building in Cincinnati, and I took a summer off, similar to what Carl's doing now. And while we were down in Florida, we had just found out my son was blind. The doctor had said incurably blind. We didn't know about his autism yet. At the end of a church service, they asked us to come forward. They may want to be prayed for. I brought my son down with my wife, and I said, my son is incurably blind. Would you lay hands on and pray him? There's no expectation, but I'm out of resources. I'll take whatever you got. A group of elders came over, and they prayed over Mr. Quinn. They didn't know who we were, didn't know who he was. And we were just desperate. I gotta tell you, amazingly, 8 years later, Mr. Quinn can reach down and find a speck on the floor, which he loves picking up specks. And where he used to always see things through a null point like this, you now wouldn't even know he's blind. Now, I wish I'd known he had autism back then. I would have had him pray for that too. But sometimes God heals, sometimes he gives you the resources to deal with your situation. And every time that summer that Quinn would have one of his, what we'd find out later was autistic breaks, there was a song we played on the radio, we had a CD. It was Our God is Greater. He's the God who can open the eyes of the blind. We would play that, he would calm down. He's the God who can turn water into wine. And that is a reminder to me of how we have over the last 8 years been in dependence with God in a way we never had before. Because he brought a circumstance in our life that required us to need resources beyond ourselves. So can we take a walk through your vineyard today? How are your resources doing? Are you feeling dry? Dusty? Feel like you've tried so hard, you've doubled down on your commitment, you've doubled down on your effort, and you don't see any of the fruit you want. You can't conjure the hope you need. You can't write the book you need. You can't force yourself to find comfort or the energy to overcome your discouragement or depression. And God would say to you, abide in me. Draw near to me. I will restore restore for the years the locusts have eaten. And where you've seen dryness, there can be fresh sprouts, new greenery, because you've tapped into my resources. You need the grapes of wisdom? Lean into me. You need to know how to forgive the unforgivable? I've done that. Lean into me. You want to know how to give mercy to somebody who doesn't deserve mercy? Lean into me. And I will produce in you and through you a vineyard of good crop, of good grape, and of wonderful fruit. But it will not happen through effort. It will happen as you lean in and get closer to the true vine. And I can help you not only bear fruit by lifting you up, but bear much fruit by pruning you as well. Maybe you want to pray, and during this next song, ask God, I have chosen other vines. I want the grapevine, the better vine. I want this kind of crop in my life. Let's pray together. Father, we confess that we have turned to other vines for our resources, other vines for our identity, other vines for our sense of comfort to reward ourselves. And Father, we ask this morning that we would declare as a community, declare as marriages, declare as families, that from this day forward, we are going to choose whenever we can to choose you to be our vine, to abide in you and to find our resource in you. For you, the God that is greater, for you proved it at Calvary, you proved it at your resurrection, and you proved it when you were able, in that moment and in that day, to turn water into wine, the best fruit. Amen.
So go ahead and stand up.